website, always promoting the Arboretum because it's
deep passion and interest for the natural world, spending all his free time learning about the worlds of insects and other animals while pursuing a degree in biochemistry at the University of Waterloo. Brad then took the opportunity to learn more about incorporating Indigenous science into his practice through a Master's of Environmental Science degree from the University of Guelph. And his project looked to weave Anishinabek knowledge into ongoing education within the university's Arboretum, a project he's somehow managed to complete through a pandemic. Brad is a member of Nipissing First Nation. I had the wonderful opportunity to meet Brad in person through a lab retreat with the WISE Lab out of University of Guelph, and he exudes a love and enthusiasm for the natural world that's immediately infectious, and I'm really looking forward to having him share with us today. So thank you to you both, Chimigwech, and I will pass it off to you, Brad. I think you can just start sharing your screen if that's what you need to do.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So infectious, in fact, that the second speaker wants to speak first. Let me do this. Okay, and then let me do this. So share screen 2. Okay, so you should just see my PowerPoint, yeah?
Yep, thanks.
Okay, wonderful. So, Junaid had reached out to me and asked if I wanted to do this. And he had said, it's got to be kind of something about insects and pollinators. And I thought, well, I really love both of those things. So of course I want to do it. So today I'm going to be giving a presentation on Aanii, our relationship with insects and the plants they pollinate. So Janae just did a absolutely wonderful land acknowledgement, but I always like to do a land acknowledgement too when I'm doing my presentations. Now, typically I see land acknowledgements are almost like little blurbs that acknowledge the land that you're living on, or the land that you work at, or the land that you study at. And I think those are really wonderful, but sometimes they can become a little bit robotic, as some of you have probably sat through. And to me, I have a really deep connection with the land. And so I would really just like us to acknowledge what the land means to each and every one of us. It could be the land that you live on. It could be the land that you like to fish at, or the land that you like to go look at insects. It could be, well, I'm here in Guelph, Ontario. It could be Guelph. It could be Ontario, or it could be all of Turtle Island itself. So I'd like you to just maybe take 30 seconds or so just to really acknowledge what the land means to you. Oops. Right. Okay, so Aanii Kinawea, Brad Howie Indigenagos, Beamsville and Nonjaba, Mukwa and Dodem, Nipissing and Benedicos. So hi everybody, I'm Brad, as I've said already multiple times. I am from Beamsville, Ontario. My Anishinaabe ancestry comes from Nipissing First Nation, and my European ancestry comes from Poland, Scotland, and England. And I want to say that as a mixed person, I honor all my ancestors equally. Not only is half of me here today, but all of me is here today, right? So, I'm 50% Anishinaabe and 50% European, and that's really what makes me me, even though I'm more on, I suppose, kind of an Anishinaabe path now. So I also want to say that obviously I'm not an elder, and I wouldn't really consider myself a knowledge holder. I really always take the stance that I'm a student, really learning about the Anishinabek culture. And I think that's a pretty special relationship that we're all going to share today, because we're all students learning today about this. So that's pretty great. And when I was young, I was really, really into reptiles and amphibians. And then I got into insects. And then I kind of, I don't know, kind of diddled around. And then I went to school for biochemistry. focused a lot more on organic chemistry, got really into math and physics and group symmetry. And then I really started to look more into plants and fungi and then geologic history. And then so really at the end of the day, I've really come to understand myself as just, a student of all of creation, because now I'm really starting to recognize all the deep relationships and connections with creation. But truly at the end of the day, I really consider myself not only a teacher, but really a storyteller. And so that's really what I'd like to do today is tell a story. Currently, I work at the University of Guelph Arboretum as the Anishinaabe environmental educator. And so for those of you who don't know what the Arboretum is, it's an absolutely fantastic green space that's directly adjacent to the University of Guelph itself. It's about 400 hectares. And the Arboretum acts as a space for research and teaching, but really most importantly to me, it acts as a space to go out and connect with the land. So it has cultivated gardens, but it's also got a lot of creators get to go on, or creators garden. We have some old growth forests here, and it's just a magnificent space. So if you're ever in the Guelph area, please come on down. It's totally free to come to the Arboretum, and it's just a really fantastic space if you're a fellow student of nature. I'm also going to be leading some workshops for the Arboretum, so check it out on the website. Always promoting the Arboretum because it's just really is a underutilized space, unfortunately, but it's just an incredible space. So, I have this slide on like, who are the Indigenous peoples? Because a lot of people reach out to me as an Indigenous person, but I don't necessarily always like the term Indigenous because everyone's Indigenous to somewhere, right? People can be Indigenous to Asia, people can be Indigenous to South America, people can be Indigenous to Africa. So we're all Indigenous to somewhere. And I certainly can't speak for all Indigenous people because, then I would speak for everybody on Earth, right? So really, I like to say that I can really only speak to my cultural traditions, which are Anishinaabe culture, or the plural term Anishinabek, which is it's a hard kind of thing to say, but broadly put, it's the First Nations of the Great Lakes region, but really it's kind of hard to draw a map per se, but it's really the Three Fire Confederacy of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and that forms, the powerful and strong Anishinabek nation. So today, I wanted to talk about our relationships with plants, or excuse me, first with insects, then with plants. So, how do you see insects, right? So a lot of people, they kind of like freak out when they see insects, and some people get really grossed out when they see insects. And then there's people like me who have just been utterly fascinated by insects their entire life and have always seen them for something that are just really cool. And I'm not just talking about butterflies and honeybees, but I like it all. This happens to be a jewel beetle, but I like beetles and moths and mantids, and really just every insect to me is just an awesome insect. And so the word for insect in Anishinaabe, which is the Anishinaabe language, and I'm really trying my best to learn the language, so forgive me for my pronunciation, is menadosh, which does translate to English, but what it really actually translates to is little spirit. So I find that really cool because, insects aren't something you just squash or you swat away. They're beings with spirit, albeit a tiny one, right? And because they have spirit and we have this shared kinship with them, they deserve just as much of respect and reciprocity as anything else, as a human being, as a tree being, as a rock being, as a bird being. So, insects, we really have to think of them like the Anishinaabe did, as little spirits that deserve that respect and reciprocity. And I always like a lot of language into the presentations I give, because the Anishinaabe language, Anishinaabe, it's such an important and vast source of the culture, of the knowledge, of the science, right? There's really no delineation between these, as I've come to understand. There's not really like an Anishinaabe science, or there's not really an Anishinaabe, culture or Anishinaabe language. It's really the Anishinaabe B'ma Dezuin, or just the Anishinaabe path. And so what are the roles of and responsibilities of insects in creation? When I walk with elders and knowledge holders, or I go to sacred fires and things like this, they're always talking about roles and responsibilities, how we as humans have roles and responsibilities, but that every single piece of creation also has roles and responsibilities. Now, insects are an incredibly, they're the most diverse organisms on Earth, or most diverse complex organisms. They're not microorganisms, but most, I should just say, most complex bilaterally symmetric organisms. And they have many different roles and responsibilities. Of course, they pollinate, which is what we're here to talk about today. They provide food for other organisms. They're at the bottom of the food chain. They act as predators and parasites. I love a lot of insects, but mosquitoes and black flies aren't my favorite, okay? And there's lots of other insects that eat those mosquitoes and black flies, say like dragonflies. And insects also have a really important role in soil dynamics and aerating the soil. And so just insects are very, very important to terrestrial ecosystems, and that importance really can't go understated. But I really think that insects have a role to teach us. I always look to all non-human beings as teachers, and well, human beings as well. So let's take a look at this guy here. So, we got a nice little bee pollinating this flower, right? But if we take a deeper look at this bee, it's got how many wings? It's got 1, 2 wings, right? And then it's got these big beady eyes. So you might think, okay, well, it's got 2 wings. Now, the order of insects that have 2 wings is called Diptera, which quite literally means 2-winged. And this actually is a fly. And so this is a syrphid, or a hoverfly. Now, hoverflies are really, really important pollinators that often go unlooked, because we hear about the bees always. Those are the big pollinators, right? But syrphid flies are incredibly important pollinators. They pollinate quite a lot of plants, and they superficially look like bees because, well, bees have stingers, right? And other animals don't want to mess with them. So the flies have managed to evolve to look like bees. But now that you have this kind of shift in perception, because most people, when I say fly, they think of you like disgusting poop creature, right? But flies are a really diverse group of organisms. And so, maybe now you think of this a little bit differently. Maybe flies have a different place in your heart and in your mind. And so Aanii, everybody, which means hello. But I've also been told by many elders that it doesn't just mean hello, but it also means that I see your light, okay? Which I think is a really cool way of saying hello to people. I'm seeing your light. I'm seeing you for your spirit and who you are. So during this past summer, I had the wonderful opportunity to use my professor's expensive macro photography camera. And, I've always taken pictures of insects my whole life, but they're with my phone. Well, now I have an iPhone, so it's a pretty good phone. But back then, I just didn't have the greatest phone. And so I couldn't really get really in-depth pictures of insects. But then this past summer, I was just taking these incredible pictures of insects, and I could really see them. And so, here we have a stick bug nymph rather. Poor little guy's missing an arm though. It'll grow back, don't worry. This is a firefly taking off. Fireflies are actually beetles. And I was lucky enough to capture this. This is another syrphid fly, another type of hoverfly. And this is a type of bee, not the native bee, or not the European honeybee, but a native bee. Because remember, the European honeybee isn't a native species to North America. The European honeybee, Apis mellifera, hasn't really been here for that long. But North America has been here for millions and millions and millions of years. And over all this time, the plants didn't just go, well, there's no honeybee. We don't need to be pollinated. No, for all this time, there was these native pollinators here. So not only do we need to save, the honeybee, but we need to save our native bees, and we really need to save our hoverfly brothers and sisters as well. And you can see this bee here, he's got the big pollen sac here on his hind legs. That's all pollen. I mean, just the pictures are great. I mean, I could see pollen grains. This is a grasshopper, and this is a stink bug nymph. And so what became immediately apparent to me over the summer and as I was looking at these pictures is, I don't know if you've noticed, but every single one of these pictures, the insect is looking right at the camera, right? They're always looking right at me. And so to me, it became obvious that insects, they see our light. They are saying Aanii, they are saying hello, but that we don't always see their light necessarily. And so I'd really like you to ask that question again that I asked at the beginning, how do you see insects? Perhaps you see them a little bit differently now, and here's another insect that's looking right at the camera. Insects actually have multiple eyes, so it's got another eye up there too, which is kind of funky. So now we've talked about our relationship with insects. Well, what about our relationships with the plants that insects pollinate? So if you like insects, you're going to really have to learn about plants, okay? It's just a natural thing of life. And really, once you start to learn about any type of natural history, whether it be birds or mammals or insects or fungi or plants, eventually you get to the point where you have to learn about other organisms because nothing is isolated in the environment. Everything has a deep relationship and connection with other forms of creation. So this is my favorite field guide here, the Field Guide to Insects and Spiders of North America. I'm such a nerd that I collect field guides. And this is my favorite one. And I would always, this was years and years ago, but I would always read about this beetle called the milkweed beetle. Now, unsurprisingly, this beetle likes to hang out on milkweed, right? So if I wanted to find this beetle, I had to find the milkweed. And I had to be able to identify milkweed. And so I started to do that. And this summer, this is kind of a funny picture, I had found these, two milkweed beetles having a good time, right? And as I was taking the pictures of this milkweed beetle, it was kind of, it was kind of a funny progression. But this milkweed beetle had kind of like turned to me and was like, hey, like, can you go away? And I just thought, look at that. Look at his little spirit. I mean, it truly is like a little Menadosh, right? Like a little spirit. And he is, again, he maybe in this case, he's not saying Aanii and hello. He's probably more saying like, go away, please. You're bugging me now. You get it? That was a good one. But so I had to really identify that. And then I just want to talk about milkweed now, right? Milkweed was considered a weed for a really long time, like a noxious weed. I've even seen things where, people back in the day, I think this was more in the 50s and 60s in that time, people were trying to eradicate milkweed because they didn't want it around. They seen it as a noxious kind of weed, right? It does have a poisonous aspect to it as well. And then there was this cultural shift. There was this perception shift of our relationship with milkweed. Now we see it as a really powerful pollinating plant. And there's a really special story between the milkweed and the monarch. And really, to me, that's why there's been such a powerful shift, because we all see the monarch butterfly as a beautiful thing, right? Most of us don't even look at it as like an insect. I think a lot of people just think of it as a beautiful butterfly that needs to be saved. And it has a really deep relationship with milkweed. So the monarch butterfly, the adult, lays its eggs on the underside of a milkweed plant. And then those eggs will hatch and become these cute little striped caterpillars. The caterpillars, they eat the leaf throughout its lifetime. And as it eats the leaf, it accumulates a toxin within itself, but it doesn't poison itself. And as the caterpillar grows, eventually it will turn into a chrysalid. And that chrysalid hangs right on the bottom of the milkweed plant. And it's this beautiful chrysalid with this gold ring around it. It's green. And then eventually the monarch butterfly, the adult, will come out. And this monarch butterfly still has the poison that it accumulated from the milkweed in its other previous lifetime as a caterpillar. And that's why they're orange. They're warning predators and saying, please don't eat me. It's called aposematic. And then the monarch butterfly flies away. But as it makes its great migration down to Mexico, it needs to eat something along the way. And what does it do? Well, it eats a lot of milkweed, right? It drinks a lot of its nectar, much like this skipper is doing in this photo here. This is milkweed flower. It's a really interesting looking flower. And that up there is actually a ladybug larvae, which is kind of cool. And so you might think, okay, well, what's in it for the milkweed, right? The monarch seems to be exploiting this plant to like no tomorrow. But there's actually a two-way street going on here, right? Because the milkweed is being pollinated by the monarch. And so when you really start to understand the relationships between insects and plants, and really any relationship between creation, it's always a reciprocal relationship, right? You know, it's a handshake, and it's an ongoing gift exchange with the natural world, to shake hands and to say, you know, thank you, miigwech, right? And it's the same thing here with the milkweed and the monarch. And there's countless examples of this in nature where there's this ongoing gift exchange. And we really need to do that too, right? Like the monarch, I don't think the monarch looks at the milkweed as a resource, looks at it as an ongoing gift exchange. You know, I've talked to some people who speak the Anishinabek language a lot more fluently than myself, and I'm always asking questions. And I've asked various elders this and knowledge holders, you know, as an environmental science student too, what's the term for natural resource? Because we always hear about natural resources and stocks in environmental science. And, you know, none of them have been able to answer my question. And I think the precise reason for that is that the Anishinaabe people, they didn't see nature. They didn't see a tree. They didn't see milkweed. They didn't see a fish. They didn't see butterflies as resources or stocks, but they seen them as kin, and they seen them as organisms who we need to have an ongoing reciprocal relationship with. And so I'd like to kind of end off here with this notion of perception. I found this cute little image today. I thought it was cool. So this gentleman here on the left is saying, well, that looks like 4 things. And this gentleman here on the right says, no, it looks like 3 things, but they're both right. It's just their perception of the actual situation itself. Now we have this perception of insects, right? I've talked about my personal perception with insects, how I've loved them my whole life. But usually when I tell people that I like insects, their first kind of thing they do is like, they say ew, or like, why, you know? But I always kind of ask them back. I'm like, well, why don't you like insects? Why do you think they're gross? And they can't really ever give me a great answer other than, you know, they are. And so sometimes I think it might be a cultural perception of insects, you know, and more of a Western culture, we don't see them as little spirits. We see them as kind of annoyance. So take a look-sees at this picture here. So this is a beautiful butterfly that's sipping on some nectar, right? This is called a Virginia tenuca. I hope I'm saying that right. I had to look up the spelling because I would always just call it a Virginia tenuca because I didn't know how to say it. Turns out that tenuca means comb in Latin, and you can see it's got this kind of comb-like antennae here. But now that I told you this is a butterfly, would you be surprised if I actually told you that this is indeed a moth, and a day-flying one at that? So maybe your perception of this has changed now. Oh, well, okay, now it's not a butterfly, it's a moth. So is it gross now because moths, you know, they have drab color and they like to eat like clothes, which isn't really true, but it actually turns out that butterflies just have evolved from moths, and they're all butterflies are just day-flying moths. And since there's sunlight out, it makes sense that they're colorful because most moths are nocturnal. So not only is this not a butterfly, it's a moth. This is also a moth that is trying to look like a wasp. And most people, when I say things like that, they'll go, oh my God, a wasp, I don't want to touch it. I don't want to be anywhere near it. It's going to sting me, right? I actually find wasps are quite gentle creatures. So maybe you have a different perception of this creature now because, you know, it's not a butterfly, it's a moth that's trying to look like a wasp. But undoubtedly and undeniably, it's a, you know, beautiful creature of creation. And so we talked about the perception of insects. Well, what about our perception of weeds, right? So my whole childhood, my dad would always talk about the dandelion. Oh, I hate the dandelion so much. It's so bad. It's so gross. I just want to get rid of it. I want to spray chemicals or just do anything I can to get rid of it. And as I got older, I started to realize started to really think, what's the issue with the dandelion? I actually kind of like them. I mean, they're actually a quite pretty yellow flower, right? And I started to watch the dandelions, and a lot of the times there's lots of honeybees and hoverflies and native bees and bumblebees that go to dandelions and sip the nectar. And this provides really important food source in deserts, right? Because in a lot of urban areas, it really is like a desert. It's grass monoculture, and there's no really nectar sources around other than the odd gardener who lives on the block. And so I thought, well, dandelions actually play a really important role, and maybe it's just our perception of that they're a so-called weed, just like the milkweed. So maybe we just need to change our perception of how we see this. And so I'd like to just end off with a few reflective questions. The first one being, how do you see weeds? This is actually jewelweed or spotted touch-me-not. But I don't think it's really a noxious weed. I quite like it. And then I'd also like to end off with this reflecting question of, how do you see insects? But this is actually a beautiful little jumping spider here, which is another story for another day. So yeah, I want to say, I really should say Chimagwech, which means many thanks to all my teachers, both human and non-human, and also Magwech for listening. And I'm not sure if we're going to do it now or after Bianca goes, but I'd like to open up the dance floor for some questions whenever. Yeah.
Yeah, Miigwech to you too, Brad.